and hopefully make things more water wise around here where we are. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Cherie Schaefer, the horticulture agent at the CSU Extension Office. I do see a lot of familiar names on the Zoom today, so a lot of you probably know that. And we have Patricia O'Brien, one of our master gardeners, helping me out with the waiting room and things like that today. So thank you, Patricia. I appreciate your help. Let's see, and you should be seeing my screen. So I'm gonna keep my video off so I have enough internet bandwidth to complete this without interruption. And there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. I also have a very short 2-question poll at the end. If you wouldn't mind sticking around and answering a couple really quick questions for me, that would be fantastic. I also just want to point out that everybody will be getting the slides and an email with some further resources that you can read into if you'd like to learn a little bit more about water-wise gardening. So let's see here. Okay, here's our topics for today. I did not name this class Xeriscape class because that kind of tends to have a little bit of a negative connotation, but hopefully we'll clear up some of that today. And we will be talking about Xeriscape as a principle and the principles of Xeriscape. So we'll talk about what is Xeriscape, where did that word come from? And then below that, you can see the 7 principles of Xeriscape gardening, and we'll go over each one of those in detail. And then, like I said, talk about some further resources if you are ready to, look at some plant lists or get a soil test or things like that. We'll go over some of your next steps. So what is Xeriscape? What is this word that we've all heard probably? So basically, the word Xeriscape is a set of 7 gardening principles that are meant to save water in the garden while still creating a beautiful landscape. So the term was coined by the Denver Water Board in 1981. So it is a local Colorado word. And it's not zero-scape. It doesn't mean that there's a lack of beauty or a lack of plants in the landscape. Actually, it means Xera, the Xeri means dry, and then scape for landscape. So it's just a dry landscape, not a zero plant landscape for sure. And we'll definitely go over some examples of landscapes that you'll see are not boring, the word zero does not come to mind when you look at them at all. So water-wise gardening tends to be a little bit more of a desirable term, especially when we're trying to introduce people to the concepts of gardening while conserving water. So that's why we tend to want to use that term, but it's really water-wise gardening. That's what xeriscaping is having a garden, having a beautiful landscape, and considering your water usage while doing it. That's all. So what is xeriscape not? Here's some of the common misconceptions about xeriscape gardening. It's not anti-lawn. You can absolutely be water-wise and have a lawn, and we'll go over being practical about your turf area and what that means. It's not just rocks and driftwood. A lot of people think that when they hear this word xeriscape, like, well, that's no plants, that's just, hardscapes, and that's not true either. Kind of on the other side of the coin, it's not just native plants only. There are plenty of plants that are well adapted to the area that might not be considered native. So it's all about plants that will do well here without a ton of input from us. It doesn't have to be natives, although natives are fantastic. And it's also not a boring monoculture. So this picture here, you can see that they found this ornamental grass. Maybe it was water-wise, it worked in this area, and they just planted a ton of it. Well, that doesn't have to be what xeriscape gardening is. That's kind of boring, and it could be a lot more colorful and beautiful and fun. Here's another example of something that I find to be a little bit boring. Just one kind of plant, not too many plants at all. No, there's open ground, so it doesn't look, does xeriscape have to look like this? The answer is definitely not. It can look more like this. And I don't know about you, but this to me is a lot more appealing to the eye. There's so much color, there's so much texture, so much variety. And can you believe it is a water-wise garden? Here's another example from one of our Xeriscape tours. This is from a tour many years ago, but another example of a beautiful, colorful garden that is practicing water-wise principles. So here are those 7 principles of Xeriscape. These are the 7 things that you should do and consider if you want to have a good water-wise garden. So step 1 is plan and design. And you can even plan and design even if you already have a landscape area, but you're kind of wanting to retrofit it to be Xeriscape. And we'll talk about that too. Improving the soil, everything always starts with the soil when we're talking plants, right? So we'll have to go over improving the soil. And then efficient irrigation. All plants are going to need irrigated, especially to start out with. They're not going to really plant anything that just right away doesn't need any water. So let's talk about how to be efficient with that watering. Plant selection and hydrozones, choosing the right plant for the right place, the right plant for your area that you live in. And then hydrozoning is a technique so you can mix in a little bit of those more high water users and do it in a wise way. We'll talk mulch. Mulch is very important in most all garden settings, but definitely important for a water-wise garden. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about having a practical, realistic turf area, something that is more usable than just something to look at a sea of green. So we'll go over that. And then we'll talk maintenance. I would say Xeriscape gardens or water-wise gardens are more low maintenance, but they're definitely not no maintenance. So we'll go over things that might need to be maintained in this type of garden so that you're ready. So let's talk plan and design. The best thing to do when starting out, if you want to plan a new water-wise garden, is to draw out your area. You want to draw out existing structures, your property lines, things you have in mind for the area, slopes, identify which areas get sun all day, which areas are very shady. How does water move through your landscape? Things like this are what you want to consider. Then okay, this area is naturally pretty shady, so I'm going to plant some more shade loving plants here. Or, when it rains, the water kind of naturally moves through here. So this would be a good place to plant some plants and take advantage of that rainwater moving. Keep in mind, south and west exposures are typically going to be your sunniest, driest places. Those are where you're going to want to put your real heat tolerant xeric plants. And you also want to consider how you're going to use the space. So if you have a nice sitting area, a nice little patio, like is in this drawing here, think about which way your furniture will be facing and what you'd like to be looking at, which plants you'd like to be looking at. And do you have a vegetable garden you're going to need to get out to? Where should that be so that it's easily accessible? Think about things like that, about when you're actually done and you're actually ready to get out there and use the space. What will make the most sense? And this drawing is very professionally done. My drawing that I would do would not look anything like this, and it doesn't have to. Just getting the ideas kind of down and getting a little bit of a plan down is the important part. Maybe you don't feel like you're that great at design. I would be one of those people for sure. So let me show you a little tool that you can use. This is from Plant Select. And I think I'll talk a little bit more about Plant Select as an organization later on in the presentation. But it is a really good organization that is a collaboration between the green industry in Colorado, Colorado State University, and they basically choose plants that are going to do well in the arid West and that are beautiful and that aren't invasive. And they promote those plants at different nurseries. And another thing you can find on their website, plantselect.org, are these pre-made designs. So this is just an example of one that I pulled off of there. And you can see here that it kind of has some dimensions, and then it has these letters, and the letters correspond to these plants over here. So these F's here correspond to Crystal River Veronica, which is going to kind of be like a blue, low growing ground cover type of plant. We have some shrubs here, and you can just kind of see that it kind of laid it out for you. Like, this is how the flow might go. This is how many plants you might need in this big of an area. So it can really, I mean, you can copy these exactly if you have the exact kind of space, or you can just kind of get an inspiration from these plant select designs. And they can be really helpful just to kind of get the wheels turning as far as what you want to see in your yard. So I would encourage you to check out plantselect.org and check out some of their designs. And that brings us to improving the soil. Usually nobody's soil is perfect. I know around here, especially, we have some different kinds of soils, some really heavy soils, some very sandy soils, and neither of those are ideal. Sandy soils tend to leach water out too fast in some cases, whereas clay soils tend to be very heavy. They don't allow a lot of oxygen penetration. The roots tend to grow a little slower. So overly sandy soil or overly clay soil isn't really ideal. Plants like pore space. They like a well draining but moist soil, something that's able to stay a little bit moist. So, and sometimes people think like, okay, I have a very heavy clay soil, so I'm going to add some sand to it. Well, that's not exactly what you want, because adding sand to clay basically gives you concrete. So you're making it probably worse by doing that. What you want to do in either of these situations, whether your soil is extra sandy or extra clay-like, is to add organic matter. And, you know, this can be in the form of a plant-based compost or something like that would be the best option, probably a great option. And, you know, the first time when you're planting, you can add that organic matter in and mix it into the soil. And then maybe on a yearly basis, just top dress a little bit with organic matter and just let that kind of break down into the soil. It'll improve the texture immensely, and the plants will be very happy. Now, once you mulch, it'll be kind of hard to add organic matter. So consider that, you know, if your soil needs a lot of attention, maybe you want to wait and focus on the soil before you plant. It kind of just depends on what exactly you want to plant and what exactly is going on with your soil. But having good soil encourages really good rooting of any plant. That means that those roots are going to be able to find water from deep down in the soil, and they're going to be a more water-wise plant. If you're not sure what's going on with your soil, it's really hard just to look at soil and tell if you're not, you know, really familiar and just out there working with it all the time. So you can get a soil test. There's soil tests you can get commercially from a lot of different places. We have soil test kits at the CSU Extension Office in Pueblo County, and if you're in another county, likely at your county extension office as well. The kits are free to pick up if anybody ever wants to go drop by the extension office and grab one. Anybody is more than welcome to take one. It has all the instructions, everything you need to do the soil test, and then you actually end up sending it up to Fort Collins, where they will actually perform the analysis. And they charge about $30 for a normal test, which will tell you basically everything you need to know for basic gardening purposes. And then you'll have an idea of the texture, you'll have an idea of the nutrient contents, everything like that, of organic matter. So it's always good. I always suggest getting a soil test, especially if you've had issues in an area before. Okay, and then efficient irrigation. That's kind of one of the big things we're here for today, right? Is to learn how to irrigate efficiently. So whether you already have an irrigation system or you're planning this from scratch, you got to consider the irrigation. So you can either plan a brand new irrigation system for the site that you have in mind, or maybe you already have an irrigation system, and so you can kind of plan your site around the system. Maybe you're taking out some lawn and you're going to put in some perennial beds, well, you can absolutely convert one of your sprinkler zones to drip. So that would be a good way to kind of retrofit that area, and an example of just planning to be efficient with your irrigation. If you already do have a system and you're going to kind of be revamping your landscape, make sure that it's working properly. Check that your emitters aren't clogged, check that water's going where you want it to, hitting the plants that you need it to hit, because that's the point of having an efficient irrigation system, right? Is that it's just watering where you need, nowhere else. Drip systems are fantastic for these kinds of landscapes, which is like flowers and ground covers and things like that. They're great for borders. They're fantastic for containers and planters, shrubs, narrow areas that are hard to irrigate otherwise. Drip isn't fantastic for a full-grown mature tree. It's really hard to get a mature tree enough water from a drip system. But as far as like perennials, shrubs, things like that go, drip is fantastic. You also want to avoid frequent shallow waterings, even though what you're planting might be more xeric, more water-wise plants. When you do irrigate them, you'll want to give them a good deep irrigation and do that the least often that you possibly can, that they possibly will let you. That way you get that water deep down, encourages good rooting. And if you're just doing those shallow waterings all the time, you're kind of encouraging shallow roots, and a shallow rooted plant isn't typically the most healthy plant. So that is not something that we want to make a habit of. And we definitely want to water by need, not necessarily on a schedule. Especially just getting these water-wise plants adapted. You want to maybe start out watering them once a week or so, but eventually you're going to want to taper off. So you're going to need to check and see how it's doing, how far the water is penetrating down into your soil. When do these specific plants need watered? Not just, every Tuesday I water. So it's better to just kind of listen to your plants a little bit more rather than do everything on a set schedule. Plant selection. It is very important to select plants that are going to work for what you have in mind. Plants that are going to do good in your area, plants that you like and think are beautiful. You should place plants together with similar needs. You don't want to put a sun lover next to a shade lover because somebody's going to lose in that situation. So group them together by their light needs, their water needs. You don't want to put something super xeric next to something that needs a lot of water because, again, somebody's going to lose in that situation. Something that is very flimsy and can't stand up to a lot of wind, you might not want to put that in a breezeway in your landscape, whereas something a little more tough and sturdy can go there. So just make these considerations before you plant. It's always good to do a lot of thinking, because once you plant, it's a lot harder to change your mind than if you just give it some thought beforehand. You want to consider exposure and drainage as well. Like we said before, the south and west exposures are going to be the sunniest and driest. So those are going to be your plants that need the most sun. So just kind of consider all of that. Go out and look at your landscape all throughout the day, see where the sun's at, and kind of make your decisions that way. Also consider shade from structures and other plants. You might have a south side exposure, but you have a really large shrub or something that's going to shade an area most of the day. So you wouldn't want to put something that needs full sun all day there. So these are things to consider. Natives are great. Natives are always great, fantastic. They support native pollinators. They tend to do really well in the area, but other plants can be well adapted too. So it doesn't always have to be natives. It can be plants that are maybe native to areas similar to ours, like Arizona or New Mexico. They are still going to do really, really fantastic here, that aren't going to need a lot of water, aren't going to need a lot of, soil changes. It's not going to need a very, fertile soil or anything like that. So just look into the plants that you want. I will be sending lots and lots of plant lists in the follow-up email, so you'll have plenty of inspiration. But you can definitely branch out and branch away from the natives, although if you have natives that are working for you, that is fantastic. Hydrozones. This is another kind of similar concept when it comes to grouping plants together by need. This is grouping plants together specifically by their water usage. So keeping all of your high water use plants in one area, and almost more importantly, keep that high water use area close to your house so that it's easy to get water to that area. You don't really want to have your high water plants way out in the yard where you have to drag a hose out there or whatever, however you're irrigating. And then the further out you go, maybe you have a low water use area and then even a no water use area, something that you're not really planning to irrigate in the long term. And don't forget bulbs. When it comes to plant selection, bulbs are often overlooked as xeric plants, but they actually are quite xeric. They take advantage of that moisture, storing it in their bulb all through the summer and fall and winter. And then they're the first things to wake up early in the spring. Beautiful spring color. They're so easy. They like full sun. They like a well-drained soil. They're dormant in the summer, which is cool because you can kind of plant your bulbs in an area and then those are going to go dormant, right when summer starts. And then you can have something else that comes up and blooms in midsummer and kind of get double use out of that area, having bulbs in the spring and something else in the summer. Iris as well. They're not exactly a bulb. They're more of a rhizome, but they also like hot, dry summer conditions and can really thrive. So yeah, bulbs are a fantastic option for a water-wise landscape. As are cacti. This is a specialized plant. Not everyone likes cacti. Not everyone has an interest in growing cacti. But if you do think that they can be quite beautiful, like I do, they're a fantastic option for a water-wise landscape. Super easy to grow. They won't tolerate excess moisture. So that's good if you have somewhere where you're not wanting to give it excess moisture. This is one of the few situations where you don't want to mulch these plants. They like the bare soil. They like it to dry out really well. And then of course, handle them carefully. There's all kinds of creative ways to handle cacti, whether it's with a big, some kind of large glove of some type or some kitchen tongs, but there's all kinds of ways that you could plant cacti and not get poked. So think outside of the box and handle them carefully. Along that same line, succulents. Great ground cover. Some examples would be like an ice plant, a stone crop, hen and chicks. A lot of these can become invasive. So it's good to not give them too much excess moisture. For one, it'll kill them, but for two, they'll just go crazy if they have too much, and you might have to keep them in check a little. But if you have an area where you wouldn't mind these succulents spreading, then that's great. Sometimes they're useful for difficult areas where you don't really know what else to plant. So definitely consider having some succulents. And I wanted to show this picture of this cacti and succulent bed at a demonstration garden. Oh boy, and I kind of forgot where. This might be a DBG or somewhere up north. But anyway, look how beautiful this just a cacti and succulent bed can be. Blooming, there's so much texture, mix in some rocks, and it could just be a real work of art. So that is inspiring for sure. I see something coming in the chat. Somebody's asking in the chat, would rock mulch work for a cacti, not directly on the plant, but very close by? And yeah, you can do some pea gravel mulch, which we'll talk about. Pea gravel was probably one of my favorites for this kind of landscape, but you'd want to pull it back a little bit from the root, or I'm sorry, like from the crown of the cactus, so that it's not right up against it, which is, yeah, what you indicated. So yes, that would be fine. Here's another type of plant that you should consider is ornamental grasses. Look how beautiful they look in the fall. So much texture, so much interest with those seed heads. And this picture is a little blurrier than it looked on my end. I apologize. But many varieties of ornamental grasses can tolerate dry conditions. They add texture to the landscape. They add movement with the breeze, height, sound. Like I said, their seed heads are beautiful in the winter. Again, they might become a little bit invasive and they might spread a little bit. So you might have to kind of maintain those and stay on top of that a little bit. But ornamental grasses are a fantastic thing to add to a xeric landscape. Let's talk mulch a little bit more. Mulch is a great thing to do in almost, I'd say, like 90% of all gardening landscaping situations. I would suggest mulch. There's just a few situations where maybe mulch wouldn't be ideal. But the main purpose is that it conserves moisture by decreasing the soil temperature so you don't have as much evaporation, reducing exposure to wind so that dries out the soil less. Also discourages competition from weeds. Mulch will absolutely hold the weeds down and keep them at bay. So you basically have two categories of mulches. Organic mulches, which is going to be like straw, compost, wood chips, things like that. These kind of mulches over time will break down. They'll improve the soil as they break down, but they probably will need to be rejuvenated and more added. And as they break down, the way they improve the soil is adding organic matter, adding pore space, aerating the soil. So organic mulches are really great in a lot of situations. Inorganic mulches would be like a plastic mulch, pea gravel, or fabric, things like that. Sometimes people use weed fabric to exclude weeds, but it also excludes water and air and doesn't leave a lot of opportunity for like native pollinators to nest. So I'm not really a big fan of weed barrier and plastic mulch and things like that, but pea gravel is a fantastic mulch to use in a xeric garden. If you have really heat tolerant plants, the pea gravel is fantastic. There will be some reflected heat off of the pea gravel, so that's why you want to use it for heat tolerant plants mainly. But you can see here that this little garden has a pea gravel mulch, and it's really the mulch of choice for a water-wise garden, I'd say. All right, our next Xeriscape principle, and one of the most interesting and maybe one of the most surprising, is reduced turf areas. So, grass in the water-wise world gets a pretty bad name, I think, most of the time, because it's the way you use it, though. When you have every front yard on your block totally done in turf, every backyard totally done in turf, it's a lot. It's a monoculture. It's not useful to pollinators. It's really not even that attractive because it's just a green carpet, right? I mean, some people really love it, and that's fine if you do. There are responsible ways to have it. So the first thing to think about is assess your current turf use. Do you have pets that need to have turf to run in and things like that? Do you have children that want to play in the turf? Then, yeah, you're going to need some grass for sure. But how much do you really need? If you just have, one little chihuahua, do you need your entire backyard to be turf? Maybe not. So think about how you can reduce the turf and still have your space be functional for your situation. Also assess ease of maintenance. If you have like narrow strips of turf, awkward corners, weird isolated islands that are hard to irrigate, maybe those could be something else. Maybe that could be some kind of perennial bed rather than turf. So consider getting rid of some of those awkward areas, making your own life easier. If you really like Kentucky bluegrass, maybe you can have some near the house in a high use area in a smaller patch that you wouldn't have to water so much of it. And then outlying areas, you can use a more tolerant grass species, or even meadow mixes, some kind of natural grass species if you like that grass look, but you don't want to go bluegrass, a high water user, all throughout your whole landscape. There's lots of other turf options that you can use that are more water wise. And I will definitely be sending you a sheet that kind of gives the pros and cons of all the different turf types that work in Colorado. And so if you are looking to maybe change up your turf or something like that, that'll be a really helpful document for you to look at. And finally, maintenance. Xeriscape does not need no maintenance, probably a lower maintenance for sure, but definitely not no maintenance. And the first thing we should discuss that I kind of have hit on a couple times, but I just want to stress it one more time, is that water is needed for establishment. Anything that you plant, it's going to need to be watered for a little while so that it can get established. It's not just going to get put in the ground and right away be drought tolerant. You will need to give it some water at first and get it to that point that it's going to be drought tolerant. Some of your flowering perennials you might need to deadhead in your xeriscape garden so that they can continue to bloom. Other perennials, and that goes for some of your maybe more water-wise annuals as well, might need deadheaded. Perennials, you know, throughout the years might get overcrowded. You might need to divide them. Some might just not have made it, and so they might need replaced. So there'll probably be some other digging and planting to do in the garden. Shrubs will need pruned, absolutely. You don't want them getting too overgrown and covering up your other planting areas. So you might need to prune your shrubs. Ornamental grasses do need cut back in most cases. And sometimes people cut ornamental grasses back in the fall. I actually suggest to cut them back around February and leave them over the winter. For one, like we talked about, it leaves a winter interest in your garden over the you know, kind of dead season when everything else is dead. You have those grasses to catch snow and things like that. It's also a habitat for beneficial insects, birds, all kinds of creatures. So leaving your ornamental grasses over the fall and winter and cutting them back in February is the way to go. Absolutely might need to prune your trees, keep those in check. That's always a good thing to do. Keep up on weeding. Even if you're using that gravel mulch, sometimes weeds will pop through, and if you keep up on it, it's not quite as big of a job. And then you might need to refresh your mulch. You know, even if you're using pea gravel, it might get kicked around, moved around, just kind of get washed away. So usually mulch does need refreshed, although the inorganic mulches like gravel will need that less than an organic mulch like a wood chips or something like that. So just to kind of wrap it up, another picture of a beautiful xeric yard here. And just to remind you that Xeriscape is not boring. It does not have to be, you know, ugly. It could be colorful. It could have so much texture, so much shape, and so much function for, you know, not only us, but for pollinators and things of that nature. So I encourage everybody to think about what they can do to introduce more water-wise concepts into your landscape. Like I said, I'm going to be sending a ton of resources your way in a follow-up email. And so you'll be able to look at all the beautiful plants that you have options for. One of the things I think, yeah, here we go. I'm going to send you some xeric annual and perennial plant lists, a xeric ground cover plant list, ornamental grasses, of course. We have a xeric tree and shrub plant list, so that's kind of interesting. The turf alternatives, which I mentioned, I'll send to you. And then I'm also going to send you a fact sheet called Xeriscaping Retrofitting Your Yard. So if you already have a landscape, but you just want to see what can I do to make this a little more water wise and a little more, you know, earth friendly, this will give you great ideas of how to get started to do that. And then, of course, if I'll remind you in the email, if you want to pick up a soil test kit, they're available at the Extension office. We're open to the public 9 to 4, Monday through Friday. And you could also go on the Soil Testing Labs website and kind of get instructions from there and just, you know, use your own container. You don't necessarily need to come get the kit from the Extension office, but you're absolutely welcome to. So those are some further resources. So be watching out for that email. Probably early next week. It'll have this recording, the slides, and all of those great resources that I just mentioned. So I'm going to leave my contact info up on the screen for a minute, and I am going to launch this poll. Oops, let me get there really quick. And if y'all wouldn't mind just answering these quick 2 questions on this poll, I would be very, very appreciative of that. So you should be seeing that pop up on your screen.